It, there we go. So just to say welcome, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So just give me a moment. There we go. And yeah, I just wanted to say welcome so much. Thank you so much for coming. A lot of you have joined us for many of the global conversations.
We don't see your screen if you're joining, if you're sharing.
Oh. Yeah.
Great.
Better? Okay,
yeah.
Awesome. Okay. Well, I'll start over. Hello and welcome, because we are going to record this, so I'll just start at the beginning. Hello and welcome. Thanks so much for joining Global Conversations today. For anybody who hasn't met me before, and I do see some familiar faces, my name is Amber and I work with our donors and partners. So I just want to say thank you for your continued support and engagement and for attending these, because, you know, we do put some work into them and we're so happy that you can learn more about our programs. Today, we're excited. We have two senior staff here to talk about our humanitarian assistance programs with a special update on Ukraine, Turkey, and Syria. So, and before I introduce our guests, I just want to give a quick rundown of what will happen. For those of you who have been here before, you know, we basically will do a quick presentation with each of our speakers talking for a few minutes, and that will be about, 20 minutes or so. And then we'll open it up for questions. So if you have questions at any time, feel free to put them in the chat, or at the end, it's really an open conversation. So you can come off mute, come back on video and ask those questions directly to our speakers as well, whatever you're most comfortable with. And we will record it, as I said, and send this out. So for any reason you have to jump off or just want to watch it later, you'll have that too. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers today. You will hear from Julie Steiger, who's our Senior Director for Humanitarian Assistance Program Operations. She joined Global Communities about 1.5 years ago, but has been in emergency response work for over 20 years. She is focused on responding now to the war in Ukraine. And if some of you may have seen her update last year, so it'll be really interesting to hear from her today, as she just got back from Ukraine as well. We also have Adam Rydell. He's our Senior Director of Humanitarian Assistance and Business Development. He has over 13 years of experience in emergency response, and he's been with Global Communities about 1 year now. So thank you both so much for taking your time. We know you're so busy doing so many things in the organization and really getting our programs running and funding and all of those fun things. So I will hand it off to you now, Julie.
Thanks, Amber, and thanks everyone for joining and your interest in learning more about our humanitarian assistance work. So maybe over to the next slide, Amber. This is just a map of the different countries where we're currently implementing humanitarian assistance programming. As you'll see, the majority of our work is in the Middle East, North Africa, Asia, and Europe region, but we do have sizable portfolios or programs in Guatemala and Honduras, and also in Africa. If you'll actually go to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about what it means to do humanitarian assistance. So we work in we deliver humanitarian assistance in camp settings. So if there is a refugee camp or the like, but also in community settings where communities might be receiving displaced people, or there might be a larger burden on them because of whatever emergency has happened in the country or crisis has happened. This could be anything ranging from man-made emergencies, so war or conflict, or sometimes famine, or even natural disasters, so hurricanes, earthquakes, etc. And our goal is to go in and support communities in that immediate aftermath of a crisis, to make sure that they have the support that they need to be able to get back on their feet and get back to their lives. And so we're there to sort of set them up to recover and get back to what life was like before, or however they're going to manage things. In these spaces, we deliver goods or services, and they're based on in-depth needs assessments that we do with community members or communities, and in close coordination and collaboration with other actors in the humanitarian assistance community. So that could be other INGOs, it could be the United Nations. It really depends on the context and who's there at the time. When we talk about the delivery of goods, this could range from delivering food, like actual food parcels, a food basket. It could be bread, flour, not bread or flour. It could be oil for cooking, beans, things like this. Usually those things are really determined by the context and what people want to eat, and you know, based on WHO and WFP World Food Program recommendations. We could be delivering shelter materials, and basically any item that support people to meet their basic needs. In terms of services, an example of providing a service would be providing a safe space or materials for children or youth to play or access more specialized support. We also may provide referrals to very specialized services like mental health support and the like. And oftentimes we just deliver cash, and we let communities and individuals decide what is best for them and how they want to use that money to support their own emergency or immediate needs. Next slide. So for Ukraine, as Amber mentioned, I just came back from there, but as a brief overview, according to the United Nations Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, the humanitarian situation in Ukraine deteriorated drastically and rapidly in 2022 after Russia invaded and escalated the already ongoing conflict there. The war continues to cause widespread death, destruction, displacement, and suffering, and has left nearly 18 million people, which is about 40% of the country's population, in need of some sort of humanitarian assistance or protection. The conflict right now is concentrated in the eastern and southern regions of the country, which I'm sure you've all seen on the news. But an increase in conflict is anticipated. There's lots of discussion about a spring offensive or counteroffensive, which increases the risk of displacement or lengthens the time that people will be displaced. It increases the acute stress, anxiety, depression, substance abuse, and post-traumatic stress disorder that pretty much affects the majority of the population in Ukraine right now. On to the next slide. So, in terms of what we're doing in Ukraine to support the needs of individuals, we're responding in 67 communities across 6 of the regions in Ukraine, which is a pretty sizable part of the country. We're using a very locally led approach. So we're working very closely with local governments, local organizations, and having them determine what the needs are and what the priorities are. And we're supporting them to be able to deliver that. In cases where they cannot do it themselves because of resources, capacity, or sort of access issues, we're then stepping in and delivering directly. So at this point, we're targeting 22,000 people. We are delivering tools and equipment for recovery. So that could be anything from like backhoes to help clear rubble. It could be medical supplies to support the local hospital. We're recovery of government administration capacities. So when there's a lot of displacement, obviously some of those services are stopped because there's no people there to do the work. So as people come back into Ukraine, we're helping to kind of reestablish those services by supporting the government officials as they need it. We're improving access to clean water, sanitation, and hygiene facilities. So that could be either doing it directly or supporting the government with tools, equipment, or grants to be able to do it themselves. And providing sort of safe, gender-sensitive shelter and settlement solutions for people who are displaced. So that could include providing cash for rent assistance or helping to work in communal living spaces to make them safer for all of the inhabitants. Next slide. Given that Ukraine is a very complex environment and a lot is happening, or different things are happening across the country, where you have, very intense conflict in some parts of the country and then more stabilization in other parts of the country, we're also supporting with sort of business recovery. So as many people were displaced, you had businesses that were disrupted, different economic activities that were disrupted. So now we're going in and helping in 3 regions to support 50 businesses with cash grants so that they can sort of re-stimulate what they had going on prior to the conflict. So this is a picture here of a women sewing group that existed prior to the war. So it's work that we were doing before the conflict even started. There was a pause during the intensity of the conflict, and now these women are back and they're looking for more support so that they can grow their business. Next slide. And this is a nice testimonial from one of our recipients of multi-purpose cash assistance through one of the programs that we delivered in the very early days of the response. So Amber, maybe you can press play here.
Вові теж немає. Нам які гроші, виходить, ми отримали грошову допомогу, цю Global Community. Ми зараз потратимо на речі. То, що діти ходять до школи, в садочок у нас син ходить, у мене син ходить в садочок, треба одяг зимовий. Поки на даний час ця у нас потреба. Нам дуже, є такі ось донори, які допомагають, їм дуже дякуємо за це, що вони допомагають нам фінансово. Це дуже важливо. Ніхто їх не принесе, ніде на роботу не устроїшся, дуже погано з роботою. А от вони, це дякую їм.
So for the cash programming that we do, this is really one of our preferred methodologies. It's to ensure that individuals have the agency and the empowerment to make their own decisions about what they need the most to support their families. As this conflict continues, the country is still under martial law. There's still high rates of military conscription. So men are being separated from their families. You have a lot of women who are left alone to take care of their children, lots of separation of families where women are potentially moving to other countries so that there's a safer place for their children, and then men are staying alone. So that presents lots of opportunity for increased risks to some of those things I mentioned earlier. So the post-traumatic stress disorder, the anxiety, all of those mental health conditions. So the longer this goes on, the higher the risk is of those things. And the more we need to be there to keep supporting people until there's a lot more stability and people can try to get back to their normal lives. So with that, I'm going to stop and hand over to Adam so he can talk a little bit about our programming in Turkey and Syria after this latest earthquake.
Julie, thanks. It's interesting to hear you talk, and I think we could just replace a lot of the needs in Ukraine for Turkey and Syria, as they're all very similar. First off, thanks for joining our call today and for hearing more about our work. This is work that Julie and I care a lot about, and we're really passionate about it, and we're grateful that you can join us on this journey as we work in these places of need. I wanted to take a few minutes to give you some updates around what's happening in the Middle East, in Turkey and in Syria, and give you a little bit of a context update, tell you a little bit about what Global Communities is doing, and answer any questions you might have for this emergency. So if you recall, maybe about 4 or 5 months ago, a very large earthquake struck Turkey, and it was in the news and it was everywhere, and it was a big emergency. I just threw the maps on there to show you what happened. If you look at the red of the map, this is a size that's about the same as the country of Germany. So the impacted area across Turkey and Syria was enormous. This was a very large earthquake. It was a very strong earthquake, and it caused a significant amount of damage. And you can see the fault, kind of the epicenters. The following day, there was a secondary, very large aftershock that had an additional damage that was caused by it. That's shown on the diagram on the right. This was a very large event, very significant emergency. It caused a lot of needs. We had over 50,000 deaths. I know at the beginning I just sat and I watched the death toll climb every day, and it's always sobering when it jumps by the thousands each day. It ended up somewhere a bit over 50,000. For every death, there were 2 injuries or so, which is a very high ratio of casualties. So 100,000 people died. And it really caused a lot of people to have to move and find safe shelter. Over 2.7 million people were displaced from their homes, trying to find safe shelter for them to stay in. And even in the Syria side, it also caught a lot of damage as well, with some fatalities, some losses, and some displacements. Even Global Communities lost 1 staff member in the north of Syria from this event. So let me focus, I'll split it between Turkey and between Syria because they're very different contexts, if you can imagine. Turkey is a very strong economy, developed country, robust government. It's in the middle of an election, so emergencies are always unique during election seasons or election years where politicians have strong presence and want to respond quickly and well. So what happened in Turkey was like a lot of urban areas were hit, a lot of large buildings collapsed, but also rural communities had homes damaged as well. A lot of people left these areas that are in red in the maps and moved to other parts of the country for temporary relocation. And they left the earthquake zones and found shelter in other cities within the country. I guess you guys are many of you are probably on the West Coast. Imagine something hitting on the West Coast and you head up to Seattle or something to find a temporary place to stay, or you go live with family in Texas or somewhere else. That's what's happening in Turkey. So now families are starting to come back. They're reassessing the damage to their homes. They're doing repairs as they're able. But for those without the means to fix their homes, they're dependent on the government to provide a service, which Turkey is planning to do. But they're also living in tents within their compounds, within their areas, in their backyard, for example, or within tented communities where many have congregated. These are called kind of settlement camps or temporary internally displaced camps. And so people are organizing themselves, finding new places to stay until they can find safe shelter in the repair recovery process. With that, as people move, they have all sorts of new needs. They can't go to work. They are dependent on someone to bring them clean water and sanitation services, and even food if they're losing their jobs or unable to work. So so that's the need from Turkey. We can go back to the other map. I think it's fine. So that's what's happening in Turkey. That's the need. Global Communities is there. You can see on the map, we got the city called Gaziantep is highlighted there. We had an office there and it survived the earthquake. Our staff were there. Many of them went through this emergency. Our Global Communities office was right there in the epicenter of this emergency, which was a unique situation for us as an organization and as a team. Shifting to the Syria side, Syria is in an entirely different context. As you know, Syria is still in the middle of a conflict. It is not entirely resolved. I know it's a long conflict. Perhaps many of you maybe have tuned out, or Syria is old news, or it's this kind of never-ending crisis, and it feels that way sometimes. But there's thousands and thousands of people still caught up in that conflict, and so this is a disaster within a disaster, which makes it even more complicated for us to respond to and for the people at the other end of the side of this. So we have the earthquake hitting in mostly northwest Syria, where northwest Syria doesn't have a lot of great infrastructure. It has a kind of functional interim government that's kind of self-appointed. There's still active conflict between parties. There's still active kind of territory shifting between warring parties or factions. You still have the presence of foreign actors. You still have the presence of terrorist organizations. It's a very complicated geopolitical space. And caught up in the middle of that is people, families, kids. What was further complicated in Syria was it had a bunch of flooding shortly after, and they just couldn't get a break. So there was a lot of flooding that hit this region shortly after the earthquake. And so many people still live in tents in Syria, and a lot of their tents were flooded, or the infrastructure just isn't there for these communities. And so we saw a lot of people moving in Turkey. So as the earthquake struck in certain parts, people again moved just as they did in Turkey, relocating to other places or places where they could find better access to services, like Julie talked about in the introduction, where they could receive food or water or shelter support. During times of crisis, people have to recognize the situations they're in and when they need a little extra help. So a lot of people were looking for extra help, and they were moving around to find it following the earthquake. So that's what's happening on the Syria side. Where global communities is certainly concerned on both sides of the needs are abundant in Turkey, but the needs are abundant in Syria as well. Syria has far less ability to absorb an emergency like this, whereas the Turkish government is quite strong. There's a lot of resources for the government to provide meaningful assistance. It's far less so on the Syria side. Let me tell you a little bit about what we've done in the last couple of months and what we're planning to do and hoping to do. So this photo is a picture of a temporary shelter on the Turkey side, where we procured a number of these shelters and were able to put families in them until their homes are repaired. This is on the Turkey side. We're providing tents and shelter on the Syria side as well. We're distributing food assistance. Julie mentioned cash assistance in Ukraine. We're taking a similar approach. Markets quickly recover from emergencies, and people can go to the store. They can buy what they need. They can meet their basic needs, but what they need is the liquidity to do so, a bit of cash in their pocket to go and prioritize their own needs. So we're also providing in-kind assistance for things like hygiene items and soaps and shampoos and things that people can take care of themselves and hopefully not get sick while they're displaced or in a less than ideal circumstance. We're organizing communities on the Syria side to organize community cleanup events, debris removal, sanitation work to make sure that their communities are clean and safe from disease outbreaks following the earthquake. And this was a traumatic event for a lot of people. It occurred very early in the morning. We had many staff survive it, and our own staff have given testimonies of what happened during this earthquake, and a lot of people are still pretty shattered. We heard stories of some of our staff who would wake up in the middle of the night, grab their children and run out of the house weeks after the earthquake, thinking that they were still in the earthquake. There's some PTSD. There's a lot of anxiety and fear. There were hundreds and hundreds of aftershocks following the initial quake. And so people are still kind of a little uneasy, a little on edge, as they should be, as they would be, as I would be if I was there as well. So Global Communities is providing that mental health support, getting people help when they need it, when they're having a hard time in their recovery. So I'll pause there because I think that's what I have prepared. That's the update on the earthquake response. I know that it's 2 crises ago. Now we're talking about Sudan in the news and the conflict that's breaking out there, or there's other things. The Turkey earthquake very quickly moved out of the news, and it's a little heartbreaking because it was a significant event. There are a lot of people suffering in that crisis. So we are so excited to take any of your questions, but I'll pass it over to Amber for the next phase of our conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adam and Julie. We really appreciate it. This was a great update, really understanding the needs in these areas and how even after a disaster, things continue to happen and we need to continue to help. So thank you so much. So now I'm going to go over to the questions in the chat. So one question we have, this is for you, Adam. What is Global Communities now allowed to do in Turkey? I know there were some initial registration issues that we had to overcome.
Yeah, great question, Jen. So the government of Turkey issued an emergency declaration and that was a 3-month window of time. We anticipate they'll extend it, maybe it's 4 or 5 months. But they basically improved the environment that allowed us to do more work under some emergency waivers. And so we do have access to provide service. We have government permission to work. They are fine with us. They have invited us to work. They are happy for the work that we can provide for this window of time where they're in an emergency declaration period. It hasn't changed our kind of permanent registration status. We're still hoping to get in a slightly better legal standing. I don't want to, we're fine with the government. We're registered. We're not, I don't want to raise any alarms with those comments, but Turkey is a very complicated bureaucratic government to work with. And so we're navigating legal frameworks as we're able to. But under the emergency waiver, we're working, we're allowed to work. The government's happy that we're working.
Great.
Pause there. Thanks for the question.
Great. And then Norm, it looks like you also had a question. I think you're on mute if you're asking your question, but I see your hand is raised.
Sorry.
There we go.
Many of us who built houses or done things like that have been frustrated by dealing with the government making us do certain things and all that stuff. What that is the residue of good government. About 5 or 6 years ago, a journalist who lived in Constantinople wrote a long scathing review of the bribery and corruption in the building trades in Constantinople and Turkey. And what happened in this particular case in Turkey and in Syria is the result of bad governance. The fact that you could do anything, you could have crappy, shoddy things built. All you had to do was bribe the right people. So one of the, this is just sort of a view of why good governance is important. We saw this in Chile and in Haiti. In Haiti, there was an earthquake that killed about 500,000 people. There was a similar earthquake in Chile that killed about 300 people. Now, what that says is governance is important, and governance means doing the right thing and building the right kind of things. And this is something that is very sad in the developing world, that these kind of things keep them down. Thank you.
Yeah, Norm, thanks for your comments. I would just add for those who are curious. So Turkey had a large earthquake in the 90s, and they refreshed their building codes to strengthen it to make it more earthquake proof. What we saw in the damage structurally was very specific buildings had very specific engineered weaknesses, where they had open floor plans on the bottom for shops and apartment buildings up top. And there wasn't the structural stability of the floors and the shops at the bottom. And that's what triggered most collapses in Turkey for this quake. But many of the newer buildings built post 90s survived the quake, including many that our staff live in Gaziantep and a few other places.
Great, thank you. And I have a question here from Nancy. What is funding available now for earthquake assistance in Turkey and Syria? Has some of the flow of funds decreased as time has passed? And then I also want, maybe Julie, you can answer the same about Ukraine, because I think that's interesting for both to ask about both.
John, your question is similar in the chat. I'll merge the two. We found it far easier to raise funds for the Syria side of things using our current donors, government donors. It has been challenging. I'll be transparent and honest. It has been challenging to raise funding for Turkey. And we've struggled to mount a large enough response that we would be more satisfied with. And funding is pretty much the primary barrier. And Secondary barrier, primary barrier being government registration, having some challenges for us to get government grants. But because we can't get government grants, we've had to be dependent on private resources like those that you guys give and contribute to. And that has been our lifeblood for the Turkey response on the side of things. Turkey, but generally speaking, you know, Turkey needs $1 billion of assistance for humanitarian needs. It's raised about 20% of it. It's a difficult crisis to get funding for. It's a development country. There are so many global needs right now, and Turkey quickly moved out of the spotlight, and that always has funding implications. Syria has chronic funding needs, and the earthquake only worsened, but we didn't see a large increase in funding availability for our organization or others. We were basically having to move money around from one crisis to the next, especially for Syria. If that answers that question, we can talk a little bit more about that.
Well, my follow-up, a question about politicization is, I mean, I just understand that, I mean, I can tell you when I've talked to people, their response has been, why would I want to donate anything that's going to Syria when actually the Assad regime will simply do what it wants with it?
Yeah.
Or you know, influence what NGOs do on the ground. I'm just wondering how real that, you know, kind of street narrative is.
Yeah, great question. You know, Syria is, think of Syria as 3 different countries. It's split up in 3 predominant areas. You have the Assad controlled areas of Damascus and the south and surrounding areas. You have the kind of the northwest, which is more, rebel controlled. I don't know, that's not the right term, but you have a more independent place in the northwest. And then you have northeast, which is kind of this autonomous area where they're kind of managing themselves self-administratively. So global communities does not work in the Assad regime areas. If that helps with the politicalization of aid question, we're not supporting Assad or his regime or that government. We are working in the northwest and in the northeast, where we do have autonomy to control where our funds go, the partners we use, the activities we do, free of interference, free of meddling, free of influence, shall we say. It's a fair question, but there's a logical answer in just understanding context and how Syria is and where we're working within the country.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, sure. I would highlight just, there are millions of people in Syria that have done nothing wrong and are just the victims of a terrible crisis and conflict. And I find that always compelling. Why do I work in Syria, or why do I, I'm sure you guys wrestle with this as donors or as people in this space. And I go back to the humanity element of it. And I think of there's families living in tents at risk of flooding, and that's enough for me. And if we can get access to them and provide assistance to them, we're gonna do everything we can to do that.
You're here.
So that's my counter narrative to a question like that. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Adam. And Julie, I think same question for you, just, you know, out of curiosity, like what has funding been like for Ukraine, and how are you, how has the flow been since now it's been over a year?
Right. So I think to start that answer off, on average, when a person is displaced, they are looking at least 10 years of being displaced. So even if this conflict wraps up rather quickly, in many of the villages where people have been displaced from, there's nothing left. Like, the communities are completely razed. There are no more services. Apartment buildings are collapsed. It will take years and years for recovery to happen. And, that's a different funding stream. Sort of that's a recovery and development funding stream, not necessarily a humanitarian assistance funding stream. But the appetite is going to have to stay there. If you look globally, and Adam can speak more to this, about all of the crises around the world and where all of the institutional funding is prioritizing, there's not enough money to meet half of the needs that are out there. And there are many, many crises out there that are just completely forgotten or are becoming, less and less and less of a priority over the years as funding shrinks with respect to all of the need, right? So all of the climate change related disasters, everything that has been bubbling up means that even really extreme cases like Yemen, where you see, in different pockets of Yemen, actual famine or high risks of famine, where institutional donor funding is decreasing year on year, because often institutional donor funding is also politicized. It is linked to a foreign policy objective, and so they make these different calculations about how much they're going to give these spaces. So in Ukraine right now, I think in the early days of the response, there was a huge amount of money that was distributed through congressional allocations. That's now dialing back, and the U.S. government, which is predominantly sort of the biggest funder for that response as an institutional donor, is really rethinking its strategy. So at this point, we are funded and we are funded through an institutional donor, but we don't really know what the future will hold, right? They're recalibrating, they're rethinking, and they're looking at how they're going to deal with all of these major responses across the globe, where all of these needs are still present, right? So we haven't solved all of these problems, they still exist. And when Ukraine happened, that was, the world's focus. And really, really closely after Ukraine happened, Turkey earthquake happened. And so that diverted some funding as well. So it's with institutional donors, it's always sort of a horse trading game. It seems like to me, I'm not in government, but it's always like a reprioritization year on year. So it's a little bit difficult for us always to predict how strong the funding streams will be because of those reprioritizations. Adam is the BD expert though. So I think he really has better responses to that.
You covered it well. There's also the type of funding that's available. And so I look at Ukraine and I think of, there's looking at the context. And if any of you follow this, there will be a counteroffensive. There will be additional conflict. There will be more fighting. And with that comes humanitarian needs. There will be new displacements coming. And so global communities needs flexible funding that can be moved around quickly, that can meet new needs as these conflicts are very rapidly moving and evolving. And our money needs to be able to move from one place to the next, from one activity to the next. So there's funding that's available, but there's also we also need the right kind of funding, the right kind of flexible, quick, adaptable money to move around quickly for changes in context, like what we will see in Ukraine in the next couple of months.
Where are the best sources of that flexible funding?
Was the question, where are the sources of those?
Yeah, what is USAID?
Yeah, there are elements of flexibility within our grant funded programs with the US government. They are not the most flexible. Most flexible would be private gifts, corporate foundations that are pretty generous and flexible and allow us to make the choices we need to make based on the things we're seeing on the ground. Yeah, so there's some flexibility within those. Our government grants have an element to it, but they're also very slow. So it's a government. If any of you have gone to a DMV to get a driver's license or something, or you know that the government doesn't always move fast, and that's true of even emergency funding in times of crisis. So they can move fast when they need to move tanks and arms to Ukraine. They're a little slower on the humanitarian funding side. So it might take us 2 months to get approval to move money from one place to the next, as an example of how unflexible they can be.
Thank you. And thank you for those questions. Does anybody have any other further questions before we say goodbye? And thank you again to our speakers today. All right. I think we're all good then. Thank you again, Adam and Julie, for coming today and sharing some insights to, in general, our humanitarian assistance program and, updates on Ukraine, Syria, and Turkey. I think, a lot of people have a lot of questions about what we're doing in our programs, and this was really informative and really nice to have a conversation with everybody. So thank you, everybody, for your ongoing support too. We'll continue to do these webinar series, so we hope to see you back soon. Thank you so much. Have a good rest of your week.
Thank you
Thank you
very much.
very much.